Welcome to another Dr. Sadler's Honest Review. This is a series in which I review books that have to do with philosophy, particularly in a practical sense. So it extends into the realm of self-help and leadership and all sorts of other practical applications of philosophy. One main area is also what we can call philosophies as ways of life. And the book that I have to review this time solidly fits into it. It is Ansgar Allen's very recent book, Cynicism, which is from MIT Press. It's part of this Essential Knowledge series, and it's just 2020, so very, very recent. It's quite good, as you're going to see in the review, and it's a nice little copy. I'm going to say a little bit about how I encountered the book, because you might say, well, this is a little bit outside of the kind of books that I'm usually reviewing. So I'm currently teaching a class on philosophy as a way of life, or philosophies as ways of life, that is called Philosophy, Mindfulness, and Life, for one of the places that I teach. That's Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design. So it's really quite cool. I'm introducing philosophical schools, concepts, practices to artists and designers who turn out to be very interested in philosophy, and then they apply it to their life and see how things pan out. So originally I got a hold of a copy of this book from our local library, which is quite well equipped, in order to do a little bit of background work and see what the latest scholarship and research had to say. And I was struck by just how well this book was written and how it suited the kind of stuff that I'm doing in these book reviews. So we're going to jump right into it, but I wanted to say a little bit about that before we got into the style, structure, summary. I like to begin the main body of these reviews by talking about the three S's. So I give some sort of summary of the work. I talk about the style, both you could say in terms of the writing, but also in terms of its layout. And then we talk about the structure of the work as well. And if I'm going to summarize this, I would say that, and I'm going to avoid any sort of value judgments at this point because I want to get into them a little bit later. What Allen is doing is providing an overview of ways of understanding cynicism in antiquity, and we can call that capital C cynicism, into the Middle Ages, modernity, the Enlightenment, and then our own time period, late modernity, or some people might say post-modernity, whatever you want to call it. And in the process, cynicism goes from being an actual movement, he's not really thinking of it as a school, into being a whole set of tropes that one can adopt, and there's also this view of lowercase c cynicism as essentially a problem of modernity as well. And so the book is spanning that, and it's really doing again, I'm going to try to avoid too much value language at the start, but it's doing quite a good job. 200 pages of the main body of the text before we get to the other parts of it, and it's a little book. This is actually quite a short essay, and there's a lot packed into it. And not an essay, a set of essays that are all connected together, and they proceed in order. So now I will actually get into some of the value stuff. This book is doing something quite well, which is, without compromising on academic rigor and bringing to bear the sort of, let's call them techniques and ways of organization typical of academic writing at its best, not bad academic writing, but really good academic writing. It's also oriented towards a much more general popular audience of literate people who want to know about cynicism. I think you could put this in the hands of a high schooler and say, here you go, you want to learn about this sort of thing. This will be provocative of thought for you. And that's actually quite good. But I'll reserve some of this for when I get to the good points of the work stuff. So let's talk about the style. That actually does fit into it. It is very readable. I think that it could be challenging in a few points, but actually not that much for most readers. There's a lot of really great stuff packed in here. It is incredibly well organized, I think. And it's, like I said, it's set out in a more or less chronological structure that makes an awful lot of sense. Let's talk about that structure then. So what do we have? We have a prelude, which is chapter 1, the problem with deviance. And then we have 2 chapters that are really focused on, well, what were the ancient Cynics about? Centering mainly on the figure of Diogenes, but bringing in some other Cynics as well and authors who are talking about this. And then we have this 4th chapter, Fear the Mob, Antique and Medieval Idealizations, where Allen is talking about how there was this tendency when cynicism actually became a big going concern in late antiquity to try to provide sanitized versions of it, right? And then things like that in the Middle Ages, in Christianity. There's some ambivalence there, you could say. And then we move into early modernity, and he talks about, for example, Rabelais and Montaigne to a certain extent. It's called Fear the Mob, or Drain the Barrel, early modern malcontents. How connected are these to cynicism? Are they in any way a revival of ancient cynicism? They may be invoking the Cynics or Diogenes, or are they kind of doing their own thing? There's, again, a real ambivalence there. And you could say that this is part of the process of going from uppercase C cynicism into lowercase c cynicism. Then chapter 6 is a really important one, Unchained the Sun, Enlightened Philosophers and Libertines. Again, it's talking about how cynicism is being appropriated, how certain people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau are being, by critics, for example, identified as being a cynic. How do we make sense out of the Marquis de Sade or Diderot or figures like that? And then the last 2 chapters are really, really interesting stuff, especially for me, but I think for anybody who's concerned with contemporary culture. Chapter 7 is called Live the End Times, the Many Faces of Modern Cynics. And the question here is, what do we make of cynicism? And are there people who could self-identify or be identified as cynics? And how accurate or appropriate are these labelings? And how do we have to understand cynicism in this extent? And Allen is making the case that this is really different kinds of things than antique cynicism. And then finally, he's got this coda, the inevitability of cynicism. And I would say that one of the key questions that the work is concerned with, and this is where it fits into philosophy of life, is one that Allen rightly identifies as a question in scholarship, recent scholarship about cynicism or reinterpretations of cynicism. What potential does it have in the present? What potential does it have for us late moderns? Can we adopt this sort of thing? Can we take bits and pieces of it and use them, as I have my own students doing in the class, using certain practices and trying to live in a semi-cynic way? Or is that always going to be, these days in late capitalism, co-opted in certain ways? So those are some really interesting questions. The book has a really great set of, we'll call them appendices, right? Or things that are outside of the text that, for me, make it a very useful volume. So there's a nice glossary and I think it could be quite useful as you're reading this to turn to the glossary early on so that you can dissociate the distinct types of cynicism that he is talking about. I'll just mention what the types are. So, right, there's ancient cynicism, idealized cynics, insider cynics, which is a variant of modern cynicism, master cynics, modern cynicism, nihilism, paternalistic cynicism, progressive cynicism, strategic cynicism, and street cynics. So, all of those are different types, and he gives a paragraph about each of them. Then we also have, extensive notes in the back. He's using endnotes. I'm not a fan of endnotes, but, they're good, and it's a small enough book that it's easy to turn back and forth. Then there's actually a great bibliography, and after the bibliography, there's a further reading of, let's see here, about 8 texts that Allen thinks are the most important for you to read. And I think I'd agree with him about a lot of these. So, he's opening the door to being able to make more sense out of all of this. So I think that's actually quite good. There's also a good index. I'm always unhappy when there isn't a good index to a book, so that's a selling point as well. So that gives you the style, structure, summary. Let's talk now about some of the key ideas. The prelude or first chapter of the work, entitled The Problem with Deviance, really does a good job setting the agenda. And what's not happening here is the usual academic, in this I will do this and this and this, and chapter 1 will do this, and chapter 2 will do this. Instead, he just jumps in and he says, listen, we've got several different kinds of cynicism here. We've got this notion in the modern period of a cynic as a person with a low view of humankind. There was a different kind of cynicism. Its most famous practitioner was Diogenes. Then he talks about him a little bit and looks at the differences between modern and ancient cynicism. And he says that both of these can be understood as deviant. Each entails some kind of departure from accepted principles of public and individual conduct. So there is a connection there. He says that as an attitude, modern cynicism is deviant in the pathological sense of the word. It afflicts us. And he's going to discuss a lot of different types of this later on. Then he says as well that cynicism might be viewed in a more favorable light. To make this argument, which I think he's doing in this book, it's necessary to spend some time outlining the contrasting philosophy of ancient cynic deviance, understood as an active preference rather than a regrettable affliction. And, then he talks about, he's got a section here, 3 problems. And he's talking about how do we make sense out of what the ancient cynics are doing and its connection to other things. And he brings up Freud, he brings up other people as well. And he says that, one of the issues that we're dealing with here is just making sense out of, what is cynic deviance in the first place? Then he says a second major problem for a book like this is the gulf, not only temporal but also in temperament, that lies between ancient cynicism and its more recent descendant, what we're experiencing a lot of the time. And I think he's quite right about that. And he says that there's a couple different other issues. So we have the difficulty of accounting for ancient cynicism by modern intellectual means, the tremendous gulf. And then he says, arguably any book about cynicism can give a sense of its object only through an act of unavoidable distortion, just as it can give a sense only of what, according to recent scholars, might be key points. So he knows that this is going to be a controversial work. And I think, quite frankly, any work on the cynics basically has to be, even if we're talking about the ancient literature, right? Because we don't have the books that these ancient cynics are supposed to have written. so we can, look at them directly. And there's a lot of other, issues and controversies that come up. He talks about modern cynicism as evasive, but I think you could also say this about ancient cynicism too, in certain ways. One of the things he highlights about ancient cynicism is that it's, as he puts it, hostile to, but also coming out of a culture of education, pedagogy, right? And also traditions that are, by that time, established of philosophy. And so it's, in some respect, an outlier, but it's not a complete outlier. It's got its own sort of like backstory development that takes place, but nobody's quite, sure exactly, who counts in that. One of the other key things that comes up in chapter 2 is this question, well, is cynicism philosophy? And if it is what kind of philosophy are we talking about? Clearly, it's a very practical orientation towards things. Does it count as a philosophy in the same way that Stoicism, which in some respects traces itself back to cynicism, or Epicureanism, or Aristotelianism, or Platonism, call themselves philosophy? Right? That's a good question to ask. Some of the really important themes that he also identifies in chapters 2 and 3, there's titles or chapter headings that kind of give this to you. Fearless speech. So for the ancient cynics, parrhesia, which I kind of like that translation, fearless speech, which he's getting from Foucault. Typically we say like freedom of speech or frankness of speech, but fearless speech is good as well. What does that mean? What does that count as? Why are they engaged in it? That's one of the key questions. Impoverishment, going around with a minimum of possessions. The Cynic costume or outfit or uniform was a staff, a cloak, and a bag. It's often translated as wallet, but it was stuff that you'd carry around. So you could imagine people today who are living as digital nomads are kind of along the same sort of lines. Why were they practicing impoverishment? Is it just that they dropped out of society because they couldn't fit in, man, and they had to get away from the rat race? No, it had to do with a diagnosis of what we human beings actually need. And looking at idealized heroes like, for example, Heracles, who goes around exhibiting, goodness to people, taking on toils, not being particularly addicted to pleasures, and doing important actions. So the Cynics, at best, were doing stuff like that. There's a great discussion in here of the Cynic attitude towards the body, which has, kind of... and I've used this word several times, an ambivalence to it, right? There's this notion that you shouldn't be like just giving into the body, and Diogenes himself was known for doing exercises to toughen the body. At the same time, the body and its needs and wants kind of educates you in what you can do, and so there's bodily acts that the Cynics do that are viewed as shameful, but they engage in it without shame. There's this theme of defacing the currency, right? The third chapter is called Deface the Currency. This is a term that got used a lot, again, associated with Diogenes the Cynic, who is supposed to, either he or his father, deface the currency. And there's actually some historical reasons recently in archaeological finds to think that may, in fact, be true. And it was typically interpreted as getting away from wrong-headed social conventions and towards a more natural human life. Aggressive teaching is another subheading that they use. The diatribe is associated with Cynics. Another genre of literature as well, or it could be also oral actions, is comedy, put down, satire. All of those things fit in with the Cynics, poking fun at things. There's a question about sophistication and, are the Cynics rejecting sophistication altogether? And the answer is, most of the time, yes. And then there's like an actual subheading about shitting. And why are they doing that? Well, I'll read a little bit of that section. Allen says, Diogenes did something kind of, unseemly. He actually took a dump in the middle of, a place where everybody could see it. And unsurprisingly, this caused great insult. And he says, one interpretation of what Diogenes was up to here is that he was authenticating his cynicism by squatting before an audience. So he's showing everybody, that he's, he's not going to be held to their rules. And then he goes on and he says, having disgraced himself so completely, Diogenes had no reason to flatter or dupe them. His authority as cynic philosopher relied on the assurance that this act gave his audience that Diogenes was not bound by any convention, including those rules that govern social intercourse. But then, Allen points out, listen, he does this in a very deliberate way. He's sending a message. He says, the problem that Diogenes presents is the fact that he chooses to act such a way and does so from a position of sophistication, namely from a position that had up until that point abided by shared norms of public conduct. One way of interpreting this act, then, is to understand it as an attack on cultured refinement, a blast from below. Very interesting discussion there. When we get into the other chapters, one of the things that we see, so the chapter following the sort of basic presentation of cynicism is the one about idealization. And we see that Allen, he rejects these idealizations, or he's at least suspicious of them. Like he says, venerable cynicisms that have origins that always remain out of reach, right? And we might be able to trace it back quite a ways, but he's interested in what he calls cynic co-option, and he points out that Stoics were doing this, right? He talks about Julian the Apostate or Julian the Emperor. There's a section here on Epictetus. There's a section on Lucian, the who's influenced to some degree by cynicism. There's a discussion about this Emperor Julian and his views on cynicism. And you have to kind of say too, when you read Julian's orations, it's clear that he's not just arguing from like a Stoic perspective. He's actually got kind of a Platonic perspective involved there as well. Then there's this great discussion of how Christians were appropriating cynicism or rejecting it. And, as he puts it, the Christian ascetics were living out a regime of self-discipline and abstention from indulgence that bore resemblance to the extreme courageous destitution of the ancient cynics. So, there's some ideas that maybe some Christian movements or figures were actually cynics. One that actually gets proposed in the New Testament scholarship is Jesus as a cynic, right? And there's a good discussion here of Sloterdijk's examination of this. It may have been that there was some cynic influence, but it doesn't seem to be that strong. Then there's a discussion of this guy Simeon the Fool, who's sort of a Christian Diogenes, who we learn about. But, for the most part, as Allen points out, the Christians are not particularly receptive to the cynics. And then we get this discussion about early modernity, right? And of course he has to talk about Rabelais, because Rabelais, not only has Diogenes as one of his characters, but if you've ever read Rabelais, it's some crazy, wild stuff. And, there could be some connection to cynicism. And, one of the things he says is, if Rabelais employs Diogenes as a subversive character and not simply as a comedic buffoon, his own self-consciously absurd activity as a tub-shuffling, drink-toting writer carries a more devious message, namely those who think they're engaged in more serious activities than the barrel rolling of a lighthearted satirist are the real dupes. He says, Rabelais invites only those readers prepared to savor him without hesitation or doubt to drink freely, frankly, and boldly from his tub now filled with wine. He also talks about, the role of the body, and he brings in Bakhtin and his interpretation of Rabelais in his famous, work on Rabelais and his world. And he says, there are some connections here that we could highlight, but Allen doesn't entirely buy it. Then there's this section, early modern malcontents, and here's where we see that cynicism, it's taking on other forms. Now, it's not completely different, right? You did have sort of cynics who were using cynicism as an excuse for world weariness and misanthropy and indulging themselves back in ancient times. That's why Julian the Apostate writes his Against the Uneducated Cynics. But there's probably more of this, you could say, in modern times going on. And so there's some interesting discussions of this here. Chapter 6, Unchained the Sun, Enlightened Philosophers and Libertines, is really bringing the idea home. And he talks about, Allen talks about, how at this point in time, there's a couple things going on. There's still this reference to capital C cynicism, but now cynicism has become, you might say, unmoored of those origins, and people can be identified as cynics, during the Enlightenment. So he says, for a final take on the ancient tradition, it's necessary to travel from the English context of the French Enlightenment, where writers like Rousseau, Diderot, and Sade were lured once more in their own idiosyncratic ways by the attractions of cynic philosophy. And I think that's right. I think that's a good way to put it. Each of them has a project that is their own. I mean, de Sade's definitely his own, and Rousseau's too. And they're drawing on cynicism to some degree, but they're taking what they want from it and then leaving out other parts. So, where are the connections, right? He says the Enlightenment philosopher's sympathy for the cynic could be that, ideas like freedom from prejudice, separation of morality from religious constraints, cosmopolitanism, the autonomy of the individual. All of these you could get from cynicism, but they're being used in different ways. And Allen actually says, as Sloterdijk argues, modern cynicism can be viewed as the distant ancestor of Enlightenment critique. It can be understood as the final melancholic resting place of an exhausted critical consciousness that has consumed itself. And he's going to pick that up a little bit later on. What else do we have going on? So in Chapter 7, we have all these different attitudes towards cynicism. And he talks about this worry that modern people have of things, falling apart. You can call it nihilism, you can call it cynicism, you can call it the lonely crowd, to echo Reisman, right? The individual who's atomized from everybody else. There's all different, ways of framing this. And, we'll just give a few others, right? Collective apathy is a form of cynicism. The problem with contemporary cynics is they lack a political imagination. And we could go on and on and on. So here's a good line here. Cynicism is said to be the product of a dangerous, self-denying, socially destructive lack of faith, a dogmatic, unthinking rejection of all efforts to social betterment. It's the condition of those who operate on the blanket assumption individuals and institutions are driven before all by a self-serving impulse, an inbuilt and insatiable greed, and therefore cannot be trusted. And so there's all these different vantage points from which people criticize cynicism. Some of them are conservative. Some of them are coming from the radical left. Marxists don't like cynics, for example. Some of them are coming from all sorts of other places. Religious people are worried about it. There's also a discussion in here, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, of late Soviet cynicism, which is quite interesting as well. And one of the things that gets talked about in the last part of this chapter is Sloterdijk's critique in Critique of Cynical Reason, right? And then whether cynicism has any insurrectional, what does he call it? Potential. Can cynicism, through intensification, can that actually lead to something new? And then finally, there's a discussion in here of two other things: Nietzsche, nihilism, and half-assed cynics. Nietzsche's, you could say connection with cynicism or attitudes towards it. And then finally, Sloterdijk and the code of shitting, right? Where cynicism, modern cynicism, is viewed as problematic, but as something that we can't really escape. The last part, he begins this last one by saying, as a result of recent scholarly interest in the phenomenon of cynicism, there's a growing list of so-called inheritors of cynic philosophy. So these range from comedians and satirists to tricksters, street artists, political activists. We might also add, other people as well. And the question here is, can cynicism really do anything, or is it just sort of a response, an active response, but ultimately an impotent response to the conditions of modernity? Is there really going to be any sort of legitimate use in the present of cynicism? And so, he talks about the internet. He also says it's still worth taking up Sloterdijk's invitation to imagine a returned Diogenes climbing out of his Athenian tub. But he says, would this really make any difference? Would this really do anything? The cynic would be understood. The cynic would be co-opted. And he says, should today's cynic manage to avoid pathologization or arrest for indecency, his or her embodied practices would be perceived as just another lifestyle choice or political statement, another exhibitionist operating within the boundaries of liberal acceptability. And I think he's pretty much right. So he says, this is sort of the conclusion of the work. Any revival of cynic philosophy is going to face a number of challenges and cannot be modeled on ancient cynicism without considerable tactical adjustment. And then he tries to, examine, well, what would that actually look like? And he's giving you, a few ideas there. I'm not going to ruin the book for you by telling you what all of them are. So those are some of the key ideas that are being brought out and put on the table. And again, in a very readable way, which is going to be quite thought-provoking if you do, in fact, get your hands on this book. As I think you can probably tell at this point, I'm a big fan of this book, and I'm looking forward to reading other things by Allen. This is really well thought out, well written, and the first good thing that I want to point out is Allen has clearly, gone through the literature, both of ancient cynicism and of the other figures that he's bringing up, and the contemporary, he mentions the last 3 decades being very important in terms of cynicism itself and academic research on it. And so he's assimilating all of that. He's giving you, as far from what I can tell, with some conversancy with the contemporary literature and all these other people that he's talking about, he's giving you the best parts. He's giving you the parts that you need in this short book. He's not doing an awful lot of quote blocks or anything. He puts it into his own words, but he's directing you at the right targets. So this is a really great assimilative interpretation of the classic literature and of the scholarship of the last 3 decades. There's a great focus on the essential aspects of Cynic philosophy in its ancient form, in this idealized, maybe kind of Platonized form, or Christianized form, and then, what counts as cynicism as we move into modernity, and the term kind of breaks up into different pictures and gets transformed. I think that he does an excellent job taking cynicism and its representatives and its key aspects and in placing them into its context. And what I mean by that is in the different historical and cultural frameworks, Allen explains what cynicism means and what it looks like in this framework, in relation to this author, in relation to this set of preoccupations or questions or problems. There are some, it's not a book that has a easy solution given at the end. It's also not doing the sort of, well, it's all very problematic and you can do whatever you want with it. Instead, what I see is Allen really grappling with what it would mean to be a cynic in any real sense, in a way that's connected to classical cynicism and not just being, kind of a sourpuss in the modern world, marked by late capitalism and by all these other developments that have been going on, which make it easy for cynicism to be co-opted. I see some really deep, well thought out considerations of the possibilities for late modern cynics. And I also want to really highlight, I think it's really cool that he doesn't just look at, the figures that he might easily look at, but he also discusses what happened in the Soviet Union. I think that that's actually quite relevant. And it could be applicable to other contexts as well. There's a kind of cynicism that emerges from that, here we go, late Soviet cynicism. He says, for one notable departure from the blanket assumption that cynicism has no positive role to play in social transformation, it's worth turning to this study of the last Soviet generation in which Alexei Yurkak unpacks what he calls the cynical reason of late socialism. And so I think this is actually quite interesting here. So he gives you a summary of how laughter, humor, and a certain attitude towards things could come about within that framework. And we know that part of what led to the fall of the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact and all of this associated stuff, it wasn't just like being exhausted economically or militarily. There was a bankruptcy that got to be shown about the culture itself. And it left some significant vacuums in its wake, as I know from my Eastern European friends and colleagues who have talked about this quite a bit. So I think that's an important thing to discuss. And I'll just say this too about the book. Now this is kind of a matter of, you could say, design, right? It's nice how it fits in your hand. It's an easy book to look through, to read. It's really well laid out. It's a very attractive book, I would say. So those are the things that I think are particularly good. But I'll also say there's a inherent goodness that runs through the whole thing, and it's well worth getting. With each work that I review, I do talk about problematic aspects of the work, and in some cases, as the reviewer, I'm highlighting things that are serious problems with a book. In this case, it's really just a matter of personal preferences, I would say, with perhaps one exception. The things that I have to say here might be viewed less as critiques and more as quibbles, but I'll put them out there anyway because you may find them interesting. So, I'm not a fan with the design thing, and I know this is more MIT than Allen himself, of these page things like this. It's sort of like, when you have blog entries and they do this big block out thing, or they do that in magazine stuff. I don't think that belongs in books. I don't find that particularly helpful. I can find the passages in there, and I don't think it's adding any value to do that. This is just a page that's wasted, and it's kind of like it interrupts your reading. Again, total quibble, right? So that's one thing. I'm not sure that I buy the criticisms of postmodernism that are being invoked in the second to last chapter. And this is actually, interestingly, in a section called Radical Left Grievances. So here's what Allen says. Cynicism can perhaps be forgiven for its stupidity so long as it yields to remedy, right? Less forgivable for some are the fashionable cynicisms of left postmodern theory, and he's got left in quotes there, which are blamed for inviting skepticism before all truth claims and doubt before our ability to submit the world about us to the dictates and progressive impulses of reason. In this context, cynicism becomes a synonym for postmodernism, construed as a, quote, debased cultural form, a monstrous hybrid aesthetic, a decadent, self-indulgent apoliticism, and an elitist, ironical nihilism. Postmodernism is here characterized as fundamentally cynical, though not, in quote, cynically suffering like Sloterdijk's melancholic victim of enlightenment, but cynically destructive, the perpetrator of a sinister assault on cognitive, aesthetic, and moral certainties. And then, he goes on and he says, I would argue those railing against this specific type of cynicism tend to misunderstand its nature, misread its intent, and vastly overestimate its reach and influence. And I think he's right about that. But he says, and yet such critics of postmodern theory will find a sympathetic audience. He's not coming straight out and saying, listen, this take on postmodernism is bullshit, which I think he should have said. Because clearly he does think it's bullshit. He's just not being completely clear with that. And I think this is important. Interestingly, like I mentioned, though, this is not the right-wingers talking about, postmodern Marxism or whatever, weird conglomerates they're gonna bring up. Who knows what it'll be a year from now that'll be the latest boogeyman. But so again, a quibble more than an actual criticism. Early in the work, there's an assertion that I don't know if I really buy, that the philosophical status of cynicism, its place within the canon, is difficult to establish given that it had no fixed dogmata and seems to have operated without a defined end or philosophical goal, otherwise known as a telos. This really depends on what works we're going to take as probably, definitive. I think this depends on the choices that we make. I will say this, in the scholarship on cynicism, there is a tendency, in the last 30 years to adopt that sort of point of view. I'm just not convinced of it. And, maybe Allen has got it right, and maybe I'm wrong about that, but it does seem to me that if we take Diogenes Laertes and, Antisthenes' portrayal and Xenophon's Symposium, and some of the other things, seriously enough, they do have some dogmata. They're just not, there's no list of principal doctrines or anything like that. So I don't know about that. The other thing I'll mention too is there is this tendency in modern scholarship on the Cynics to say that the genealogy of the Cynics is actually just a made-up thing later on, that, it's sort of like looking back, and Antisthenes really wasn't a Cynic. He may not have taught Diogenes at all. The Stoics, create this timeline and genealogy to justify their own stuff. I just, same thing too with rejecting Lucian's dialogue as not being genuinely by Lucian, because he gives, he lets the Cynic argue against him and win the argument. I don't know that I buy these things. I can't say that I'm like a, Camp Antisthenes guy or something like that. But I think that it is a problem. And, the fact that Antisthenes doesn't get brought up in the work until the 4th chapter, I see that as not a weak point, but an interpretive choice that I don't share. So again, I don't actually have any big criticisms of the work. These are just things that people might find interesting if they're into cynicism. So on the whole, too, these are greatly outweighed by the good points of the work. All right, to sum up, if you want to know about ancient cynicism and its possibilities for applicability within the present, you want to get this book. It's really well written, and it's scholarly, but also readable by the ordinary person. There is a lot to learn. If you haven't read much about the Cynics or some of the other figures who are being mentioned, you're going to learn quite a lot from getting this book. Even if you are somebody who encountered the Cynics, decades ago and has been thinking about them and teaching about them, you can benefit from, as I have, from reading this book. So Ansgar Allen, Cynicism, without any qualifications, recommend it.